Excellency, Mr. Mohamed Warsama, Minister of Health of the Republic of Djibouti, Your Excellency, Ambassador Ranieri, Head of the European Union, our private sector representative, Chairman and CEO of Infotech Investment Group and Vice Chairman of the Afro Champions Club, Mr. Ali Mafuruki, the private sector for whom we are here today, civil society, distinguished guests, ambassadors, representatives from the African Union Commission, ladies and gentlemen. Let me begin by saying that our thoughts and prayers are with the people of Ethiopia and Sudan at this difficult time, and we wish them all peace soon as we watch the events in both countries unfold. The Secretary General, of course, and the whole UN family is working tirelessly, particularly in Sudan, to see how we can bring peace to that. And I want to recognize as well the Special Representative, Mr. Parfait, who is here with us today, and we'll be talking about this in a few minutes. The theme that brings us together today is certainly of paramount importance for Africa, and especially also for the conversation around peace. Because one can get at peace, as the Secretary General would say, in many ways. He always talks about the tripod, the discussion around peace, security, and development. Today we want to get to peace and security with the development angle. And the development angle is, I think, something that the African heads of states have voted for resolutely as they have signed the African Free Trade Area Agreement. We are here today on the eve of the ratification and the official launch of the African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement in Niamey in a few days. We must now move ahead with speed to implement and reap the benefits of the African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement. And that is really going to be the conversation that we will be having today. And I want to thank all of you on behalf of the African Union, the European Commission, the ECA, and of course, our partners and host, the government of Ethiopia, for making this possible and for having this conversation. I think that we thought this was important because as we go to Niamey and have that conversation, it is important that the private sector and civil society and the youth realize why Niamey is so important in the building of an Africa that should be working together. We are talking about the East Africa region. The East Africa region is one of the regions, as we like to say, that is experiencing fast growth. However, when you look around the region, that growth is not yet translating into poverty reduction and or prosperity as we would like to see it. And I think we always wonder why, and we ask the question, where are we going? And we believe that it is because we haven't yet really powered the engine of growth in the sub-region. Climate change is holding us back. Peace and security, of course, are holding us back. We believe that by unleashing trade, we could actually advance the lot of most of the Horn of Africa. We believe that trade and integration will be one of the solutions that can bring us hope. These are immense. We continue to talk about immense opportunities on the continent and particularly in the sub-region. But I think that when we have the CFTA, we're no longer talking about hope. We're talking about how we implement it. It's no longer a dream. It's actually something that we can start working towards. It's something that we can begin to implement. The major promise of the CFTA does not lie in the fact that we are signing an agreement. It lies in the fact that we can bring together, some of you who are in this room today, national champions. The fruit of the CFTA is really to say, how can we, first of all, create regional value chains? How can we ensure that those of you that have succeeded in your countries, and as we know, we are a continent of over 50 nation states, most of them not large enough. So we need big markets, we need scale. As we stand in this region, we talk about 600 million people. If you have a market of 600 million people, you begin to talk about creating jobs, you begin to talk about a sustainable demand, you begin to talk about real prosperity. And I think that is what the CFTA is about. It is about 600 million in the Horn of Africa, or the larger Horn of Africa, as we were saying with the minister from Seychelles. But it is also about the whole of the continent, which is 1.2 billion people. So really, it is the promise of a global market, the largest market since the WTO was formed, the largest free trade area since the WTO was formed. What do we mean when we talk about ensuring that we have regional value chains. And we have picked, I think Ambassador Ranieri talked about it earlier, the pharmaceutical sector, a little bit because we had the conversation in February on the health sector. And the pharmaceutical sector turned out to be one of the sectors which is a nice illustration and a good summary of what the CFTA could deliver for us, in the sense that we do have small economies, we have large economies in the sub-region and on the continent, and then we have national champions, but we have not succeeded in creating in the pharmaceutical sector on the continent global champions. However, the market for pharmaceuticals, as we look at it and as we talk about it, is quite substantial. In 2030, it was a $20.8 billion market on the continent. It is projected to become a $65 billion market. So in 10 years, it has grown by 40, it will grow by $40 billion. This is the creation of about 16 million jobs. In a sub-region where unemployment is about 16% on average, we are talking about being able to create not just the CFTA, but regional giants and jobs. And by jobs, we're also talking about prosperity. We believe that by doing that and by integrating collectively in that process, we will actually be then delivering the promise of the CFTA. The pharmaceutical sectors, and I think in the room today we have members from the private sector, from Egypt, Kenya, and Ethiopia, and we want to thank all of you for being here with us, the private sector, because you are those national champions we are hoping will become regional and continental champions. We are hoping that with the CFTA and, of course, with the free movement of goods, we can actually be able to move pharmaceutical products across the continent. The cost of pharmaceuticals today in our national budgets, particularly in the Horn of Africa, is about 40% of the health budget. So it's a huge chunk of the health budget. And as I look at Seychelles and as I look at Djibouti, because they are small countries, the cost of drugs is actually 3 times the price. So on average, if you buy aspirin in Ethiopia for $1, in Djibouti it costs about $3, and in Seychelles it costs $6. Those are the magnitudes we're talking about because of scale. Nobody wants to deliver in a small country, cost of transportation, cost of procurement and all that. It just augments the cost. On the other side, in Egypt, where Egypt is the largest producer of pharmaceuticals on the continent today, followed by Kenya, they do have stockpiles, and they cannot sell or deploy those medicines across the continent because we had border barriers. Now with the CFTA, you can actually open those markets. Same thing in Kenya. You can actually open those markets, but it's not enough to open those markets. It's also important to bring the scale together. And I think part of the conversation that we want to have today is about resource pooling, drug procurement pooling, and how we can do that so that comprehensively from Djibouti to Eritrea to Ethiopia to Kenya to Seychelles, we can pool together these procurements to ensure that, one, we create some fiscal space in the budgets of the states, but also that our citizens can get drugs. And as we talk about this, then we go into other parts of the conversation around the CFTA and the second bit of this conversation, which is really about intellectual property rights, standards, and good quality drugs. It's not enough that we buy expensive drugs on the continent. It is also particularly important that as we buy expensive drugs, most of the time we're not buying drugs that are certified or of good quality. And I think that part of what we're trying to do with the CFTA is also ensure with the standards conversation that the drugs that we get are of good quality and are actually helping to cure our citizens. So that is really the first part of what I wanted to talk about. It's how we go from using one concrete example, which is the pharmaceutical sector, we can actually at the same time create regional champions, create global champions. We know that with the CFTA, what we're trying to do is say that first of all, we create regional champions who can then get into global value chains, but we must create, I think, a regional base for jobs, a regional base for employment, and a regional base for research and development. Kenya and Egypt today spend almost 15% of their research on the pharmaceutical sector. So there is a lot of innovation happening in that sector, which can continue to power our economies. The second big issue then, of course, becomes the issue of infrastructure. Doing business is one thing to have the companies, is one thing to produce the drugs, is another thing to be able to move them across borders. It's another thing to be able to ensure that when we get to the port of Djibouti, Mr. Ambassador, Mr. Minister, that we can actually take our goods out of the port very quickly. The good news is that we, as we talk about the global sub-region, have a few countries that are doing quite well in the doing business. Of course, we have Seychelles, we have Kenya, we have Djibouti, that have once been top 10 in the doing business. We have, of course, Ethiopia that is looking to be part of that group of countries that are in the top 10 of the doing business. It is going to be important because as we link and as we do the doing business, we need the ports. But we also need the time it takes. In some countries in the sub-region today, it takes 180 days to get goods out of the ports, and in others it takes 17. We can all come to the 17 days and ensure that with the CFTA, our infrastructure works. And I think this is the whole point of the CFTA as well. It is how we can improve the overall doing business. And this will not just be for the pharmaceutical sector, but it is for the logistics sector, it is for the trade sector, which will then in turn create another set of jobs for the youth in this part of the world. That is, I think, the second most important part of the CFTA. It is the infrastructure and the investment that it will pull together. We are also sitting in a region which has quite a diverse base of energy, and energy is, we cannot have those pharmaceutical industries. I think one of the reasons why Egypt and Kenya are so competitive is because they do have competitive energy, and the cost of energy in these countries is quite low, and their production can be quite competitive. We would like that to be the case in all the countries that we're talking about. And so part of the CFTA is seeing how we can ensure not just that energy is produced, but that clean and renewable energy is produced, because as we talk about the CFTA, as we talk about growth, particularly in the sub-region, the issue of climate change must remain, I think, a core concern and a core priority for us. But with the CFTA and with integrating markets, not only do we integrate pharmaceutical markets, we can also integrate our energy markets and ensure then that we have an energy power pool that ensures that everybody in the sub-region and in the Horn can have access to affordable, accessible, and reliable energy. So that is the second big part of the CFTA. After creating national champions, regional champions, it is really about infrastructure, crowding in foreign direct investment to ensure that we get the infrastructure that is needed to continue to power growth in the sub-region in a more equitable way. And finally, the third thing that I want to talk about is how the CFTA will take the sub-region and the rest of Africa into the global environment and the global conversation. As we speak today, there's a number of conversations going on. Of course, there's the trade wars and the conversation around, standards. There's a conversation also that is happening in the world around what we do with our migrants and what we do with labor that is the global platforms for e-commerce. I think all these things, and particularly in this region, I think that many more countries are now beginning to look at how can we get into the WTO. I believe, and I am convinced, that part of the reason why there is a WTO rush from this part of the region is particularly because we have had this long conversation on the CFTA, and there is now a recognition that getting into global platforms where we can adjudicate trade discussions is a good idea. And we want to encourage, and the Economic Commission for Africa stands ready to continue to support the countries that are working towards WTO accession. It is particularly important for Africa because for once, under the framework of the CFTA, we are talking about e-commerce. And we are talking about Africa producing a framework for e-commerce. We can actually go to these global platforms with a position that has been negotiated as a continent because we are negotiating the CFTA. So as we talk about the CFTA, we are actually beginning to have those conversations on more global issues, which allows us, as we go to those global platforms, to be able to talk with one voice. Something that I always like to talk about, which is particularly important, related to e-commerce, is intellectual property rights. The second phase of the CFTA discussions is going to be on intellectual property rights. This is very important, of course, for the pharmaceutical sector, but it is even more important for our youth that are developing new applications in the technology sector that need to ensure that their innovations are protected, that they can actually get to that pathway to prosperity with these innovations. And I think that having, first of all, an African conversation around intellectual property rights is particularly important in how we frame the conversation when we get to the global stage on intellectual property rights. Of course, competition policy. We have the ambassador of the United States here. We have the competition clauses and the competition laws, and we have the Treaty of Versailles and the European competition policy. It was about time that Africa also now finally develop a competition policy that is African and that can interact with the rest of the world. And I think this is what the CFTA is also putting in place in the second phase of negotiations. This is why all these conversations are quite important, because it actually helps us link ourselves. It creates that infrastructure that should bring us together. It gives us, of course, the physical need to come together because it creates physical space. and gives us some savings so that we can ensure that everybody comes along with us. Agenda 2063 is summarized, I think, in the CFTA. And to get to the Africa we want, I think the CFTA is almost, as the French would say, a passage obligé. Of course, this year is the year in the African Union of refugees, internally displaced people, and migrants. And we have about 23 million of them on the continent, but most of them are in this part of the region as well. And I think as we have that conversation on the CFTA and we have the conversation on trade, we need to ensure that it is inclusive enough, that it brings this part of the population into the conversation. We are working with most of our UN agencies and others, in particular UNHCR, to see how one can give ID and identification to this segment of the population to ensure that, particularly using the e-commerce platforms and others, they also become active members of society. So as you see, the CFTA is really not just some trade agreement. I have tried to show you that it is actually a comprehensive development plan for the continent, and in particular for the sub-region. It really helps us to bring together, I think, conversations on peace, development, and security, but more importantly, on the creation of jobs and prosperity for our citizens. And that is why I think this conversation today is particularly important, because one, we hope that we can get to know each other, that the civil society, that the private sector for whom this agreement is really destined, that you begin to understand it. Of course, there are going to be some tricky issues. We are still working on questions of rule of origins, and we're finalizing them. Our ministers of trade, as we speak, still meeting to finalize those issues. The issues of dispute resolution. Who says trade says some disputes. Even in the best of countries, there are a few. And I think we are putting in place the infrastructure for that. We would like to hear from you. We would like to ensure that you are continuously engaged. When we go to Niamey, we would launch officially the CFTA, but it's going to take a year to actually come into being. I think the ECA, the African Union Commission, and all the other agencies that are working on the subject, the whole UN family, our partners, the EU, the USAID, and everybody else that is working with us on this. Of course, I think we have the business sector, Afro champions that Ali Mufuruki represents, and I think that is why we have you here. Thank you very much, Ali, for being here with us. Is really to ensure that the voice of the private sector is heard in this conversation. So once again, I want to thank you very much for taking the time to come. And hopefully that we will have over the next 2 days a very interesting conversation, and that if you were halfway convinced about the importance of the CFTA being a global framework for Africa's economic development and economic independence, that by the time you leave here, you are convinced that if we want to get to Agenda 2063, passing by Agenda 2030, of course, this is the way to go. Thank you very much.